Hey everyone, and welcome to Quick Review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at Sekiro, a game that I felt I absolutely had to review. For me, one of the reasons I decided to start reviewing games in general was because of the Dark Souls series. To me, Dark Souls is a game that was always misreviewed, and I just never shared the opinions that everybody else seemed to have about Dark Souls. To me, Dark Souls and Sekiro are not actually difficult games, and that's always been the popular opinion that surrounds the Dark Souls series in general. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that's what defines it as a series: difficulty. These games aren't difficult because they're designed in a way that ensures that the player is going to fail. It does that by not giving the player the tools that they actually need to succeed, or by throwing traps in the player's face that are almost assuredly going to kill that player the first time that they see them. In my opinion, the Souls games and Sekiro are a little bit more of an action puzzle crossover. And I say that not because they aren't action games, they aren't adventure games, but most of the difficulty comes from trying to solve a puzzle or discover what the best way to approach something is. For example, once you know that a giant rock is going to fall down the stairs, or a dragon is going to jump over a wall, you can immediately, after dying once or twice, figure out how to get around that and resolve that problem. The first time you go through it, there's absolutely no way, unless you're lucky, you could have gotten around that. In my mind, these games are more akin to building a fire than they are anything else. If you sat a person down and gave them all of the tools that they needed to build a fire, and then you didn't actually tell them how to do it, or they had no prior knowledge of how to make a fire, well, they'd sit down in front of all of those tools, and over time, trying different things out, knowing that they could build a fire, they would eventually, hopefully, be able to actually create that fire. There would be a lot of trial and error, there would be a lot of guessing, and to be entirely honest, not all the time would somebody actually figure out how to put that fire together. To me, that's what Dark Souls is. As soon as you have an explanation or you understand how to do something in the game, the difficulty curve pretty much disappears. That isn't to say that there isn't a degree of execution or skill that's associated with coming up with a solid strategy or solving that puzzle. Once you know how to do something in Dark Souls or Sekiro, you still, to a degree, need to execute on that strategy. However, if you compare it to other difficult games in the action genre, it's not quite as difficult. If you look at other action games that are generally considered to be difficult, once you know the correct strategy for a boss, the actual execution of that can still be difficult. That's because those games give you complex, fluent controls that allow for a large degree of error and finesse when you're actually trying to do something. In the case of Dark Souls and Sekiro, I feel like while it is, to a degree, still execution-based, it's not on the same level of difficulty that you often see in other action games. The difficulty, or at the very least, the cause of deaths in these games, are more closely linked to not knowing what to do, rather than being unable to execute on a plan or a strategy. With all of that out of the way, I feel like it's worth mentioning that I got through Sekiro in about 20 hours of playtime. I definitely skipped a couple of bosses that I probably didn't even know existed, or couldn't have known existed, and I think my death count totaled somewhere in and around 100. It might have been a little bit less, it might have been a little bit more. Comparisons aside, let's talk about Sekiro itself. Sekiro has done a lot of things to improve on the formula that was sort of set in place from the Dark Souls games, but at the same time, it also sort of stepped back and made a couple of things a little bit worse in my opinion. First of all, in Sekiro, there's actually a story that's forefront to the game. You know who your character is, you know who the associating characters are, and you have a general purpose and goal as you progress through the game. It's far from something that I would call a good story, but it's a story nonetheless, and I feel like that's something that Dark Souls generally lacked, unless of course you decide to read into all of the lore. It just wasn't there in front of you. Another thing that Sekiro does well is it introduces stealth, and the stealth in this game is actually executed in an enjoyable way. You're given a wide array of ways to kill your enemies when you actually successfully sneak up on them, and you're given a wide variety of ways to also escape from your enemies and enter back into stealth if you've accidentally made a mistake. The addition of stealth also adds to being able to make it through an area. If you're having trouble getting through an area by just running in guns blazing, you might instead be able to find a sort of sneaky approach to get in there and clear a room out without actually having to be great or phenomenal at some of the aspects of combat in this game. In regards to some of the things that aren't either done better or done worse, the combat in Sekiro feels very different than some of the predecessors in the Dark Souls series. Basically, instead of relying heavily on rolling or ranged attacks, you instead benefit largely from getting directly into the fray and abusing to a very large degree your ability to block. Combat as a whole seems to be very block-centric in Sekiro. There are definitely some opportunities where you'll want to jump away, or roll, or run, and that can be because you're trying to avoid an unblockable attack. But for the most part, combat can be broken down to swing at your enemy once or twice, block a couple of attacks, swing at your enemy a couple more times, and you'll eventually break your enemy's poise and you'll win the fight. From my perspective, combat is relatively simple. I feel like there's a general formula that you can apply to almost every single fight in this game. And that's actually one of my problems with Sekiro. I felt like a lot of the bosses, despite the wide diversity of fights available, could all be broken down to generally the same formula. As soon as you learned what their attacks were, and timed your blocks correctly, almost every single fight was over. There were one or two exceptions to this rule, and without spoiling anything, one of the biggest problems was the final fight of the game. Part of this fight could basically be broken down to running around in circles and just waiting for an opportunity to hit the boss. It wasn't enjoyable and it wasn't fun. Had they just stuck to the mechanic that had already existed, which was blocking all of the attacks, I think that the final fight could have been significantly less tedious than it actually was. And that's one of the things that was interesting to me about Sekiro. When it came down to fighting bosses, I feel like I only had to make 2 or 3 attempts on the vast majority of the fights, and that's because they all devolved into the same approach. However, on certain fights like the final fight in the game, that strategy had to change and I found myself taking pretty much the majority of my deaths between the final fight and one other fight significantly earlier in the game when I was still figuring out and learning how to apply this formula. There are a few other aspects of gameplay that Sekiro introduces though. For example, you are able to grapple around with your arm. Unfortunately, the grappling hook seems largely underutilized over the course of the game. There are pretty much no major boss fights that involve this as a mechanic in any way. From time to time, you'll be able to use your grappling hook to get closer to the boss and stagger them a little bit, but for the most part, it's a largely forgotten mechanic. The only place where it really shines is if you're trying to be particularly stealthy, but it's still not that useful. It's almost like you can use it and it's kind of cool to get above everyone or sneakily get behind somebody using it, but for the most part it's just easier to walk around, crouch in the grass, and sneak up on someone. It's something that could have been really cool, and it just feels like they could have designed the levels a little better to actually leverage the grappling hook. Another addition is the use of prosthetic attacks. As you go through the game, you find different ways to enhance your arm, and this can be as simple as using throwing items through your arm or turning it into a flamethrower. At its core, that sounds pretty cool. You'd think that being able to use your arm as a flamethrower would actually be relevant, and it could help you win some fights. Unfortunately, again, you would be very wrong. While you definitely can choose to leverage your prosthetic attacks, it just seems largely useless. Because why would you choose to use a prosthetic attack when you could just hack and slash your way to victory in almost any fight. If you have the art of hacking and slashing in this game down, trying to balance it with prosthetic attacks can actually sort of ruin your groove a little bit. Figuring out exactly when to time a prosthetic attack changes the pace of a battle, and if you have figured out how to win that battle already by blocking and slashing, the use of prosthetics is just counterintuitive. With that said, if you're trying to optimize your playthrough, if you're speedrunning this game, I'm sure there's some very positive way to leverage prosthetic attacks. I'm sure there's something that I missed that could have made some of these boss fights significantly easier by leveraging the correct prosthetic attack. But the point is just that you can get through the game easily enough without having to do that, without having to resolve those problems. It could have been a much larger feature of the game. It could have been something that you actually had to use. Additionally, the death mechanics work a little differently in Sekiro. Instead of running back to your body when you die to reclaim your lost souls, instead, you just lose half of your gold and some of your skill experience. There is a chance that you won't lose anything, and the odds of nothing happening is tied to how many times you've died and how much Dragon Rot has built up. Dragon Rot is basically the death mechanic in Sekiro. Every time you die, a little bit more Dragon Rot builds up. Honestly, it barely impacts the game. You may not be able to complete some side quests while the world is plagued with Dragon Rot, but that's about it. I almost never actually used my gold, so losing it didn't really impede my ability to progress. Last but not least, let's talk about the skills. As you progress through the game, you can unlock different skills that give you different abilities, or enhance your passive or innate abilities to perform simple actions through the game. I made it through the game without unlocking probably half of the skills, so I may not be the best to talk about customizability of your character, but compared to Dark Souls games where you actually had to choose your stats, choose the weapons that you use, choose your abilities, the degree of customization that exists in Sekiro is just lacking compared to other Souls games. And finally, if for some reason you actually want to play this game again, there is a New Game Plus mode that's available as soon as you beat it the first time, and it does actually add a couple of new challenges into the game as well. Either ways, that's my almost rant about Sekiro, because it was still an enjoyable game. I enjoyed playing this game. I think that Dark Souls and Sekiro are all pretty fun games in general. I feel like my only issue with the franchise is the misperception of difficulty. Because honestly, at the end of the day, these games are fun. I don't know if they justify their full AAA modern day price tag, because honestly, again, it was 20 hours of playtime for me. Mileage may vary, but it's still not the longest or bulkiest of games out there. And don't forget, this is just in my opinion. If you disagree with anything I said, and I'm sure a lot of people probably will, if you feel like I left something out, or if you just want to suggest another game for me to review, leave a comment. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and make sure to check back weekly for more reviews.